Hello and welcome to Season 2, Episode 2, Tiny Hardware, Big Cloud. Set yourself, free RTOS. I'm Rudy.
I'm Wale, and we're joined by Dan Griffin from the FreeArt team. We're going to dive into embedded modules, prototyping, and everything around IoT device management. Get ready to IoT all the things.
Okay, so yeah, well, did you say hi, Dan?
Hi, Dan.
Perfect. So if you haven't joined IoT all the things, give a little bit of premise of the show. We're going to dive into a ton of stuff around IoT. Everything relates to embedded systems, to the cloud, to analytics. I'm Wale Oladihin. I'm a technical lead for IoT Solution Architects.
And I'm Rudy Chetty. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect with AWS.
And we have the pleasure of having Dan Griffin join us for this episode. So Dan.
Thank you very much. I'm Dan Griffin. I'm a senior software engineer on the FreeArt team in Amazon Web Services.
So it's pretty awesome to have Dan here because we will get to pick his brain about all things on the embedded side. So really excited about the show we have planned for you today. So we want to actually dive in with a couple things that have been like really cool announcements. So one of them has been on the kind of what's new portion of Amazon AWS IoT Greengrass, which just released APT support. So what you're going to be able to do is through this package management, basically like install and run Greengrass on your Linux operating system. So making it easier from going that prototyping phase to production. And I know there's been some really cool stuff on the FreeArt side too as well, Dan.
Yeah, that's right. Same vein, actually. You just talked about Greengrass, better support for going from prototyping phase to a wider spectrum of production devices, scaling out to end devices in the field. FreeArt, a big announcement is that we now have a long-term support roadmap for the kernel and libraries, and we'll have a long-term support or LTS release out by the end of the year. And what this screen shows with respect to our LTS release on freeartos.org is if we scroll down a little bit, you can see first our commitment for having the LTS release out this year. Second, the list of libraries that are included in that release. And finally, the code quality, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this throughout the show, the code quality that we're committing as part of making this long-term support. And so again, like the Greengrass announcement, the FreeArtos LTS announcement is all about helping customers go from prototyping to their first production module to out to end devices in the field.
That's so cool.
Nice. And I think this could be an awesome segue because we want to do get our challenge set up so we can get the Twitch channel going. So we are signing ourselves up for more work, but what we think an awesome challenge would be is that you should essentially give us an idea to prototype something. It can be anything. It could be, we want you to prototype drones, or we want you to prototype smart home skills and anything like that. So put it inside of the Twitch chat and tell us what you want us to prototype, and then we will pick our winner at probably by the end of the show, or we'll tweet you out like, hey, we're going to do this prototype.
Yeah, and to give you guys some ideas, I'll paste a link in the chat as well. This is to one of the training modules we have on AWS training. It's actually a prototype that I built with a little container truck and sensors built onto it. So, I mean, really, this is what we were trying to get your feedback on so that we can build it and show you maybe on the next episode or two. No commitments on timelines, It's done when it's done, right?
If you could pick Rudy's, that would make our lives much easier.
Just pick.
So, we'll style it up with some CSS and stuff like that. But I
think that's a good idea.
Can I vote for yours?
Yeah, I think you should. So can we do plus one?
Yeah.
Sweet. Keep the ideas coming. We'll check in, and then you know what? We'll take it. Maybe we'll announce the winner at the next episode. So we'll mull over all the recommendations. So
mull over all the things.
All the things. So now we kind of talk about prototyping. Love to dive in right away with you, Dan, about like how the FreeArt team and AWS kind of thinks about that. You mentioned prototyping to getting started to getting into production. What's your kind of thought process for customers?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. It's similar to what we were just talking about actually going back to the announcement from the Greengrass team for Linux support, as well as for the FreeArt team for LTS. And frankly, what you guys are about to go through with what I hope is a very difficult prototyping exercise from
we're bringing you back. For that.
yeah, from our audience, which is, my point is that you start from, we have this journey that we call 0 to 1 to n. And what you guys are going to do is you're going to start with 0. You're going to start with a prototype of this challenge. What our customers do, somewhat more seriously, is our customers start with a real business need. And let's say for a new product line, what you're starting with is a prototype. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how do we make sure that across that journey from your prototype, which is 0, to your production module, which is 1, to your field deployment, which is n, we've given customers the tools they need to keep the quality bar high. Mm-hmm. And so that's the 0 to 1 to n journey that I think we've got some tools and some website call outs, the code, the tests, the long-term support, all that plays into that.
Awesome. And I think what's interesting is, I work with customers, and it's, what they'll do is they'll basically just say, I'm just going to grab something off the shelf, right? I'll get a pie, and I use pies as well. It's great to just kick the tires on, but they say I want to take this pie, and all of a sudden I'm just going to put that in my factory floor, and we're like, whoa, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in between. And so kind of having this prescriptive path of what hardware should you look at? Does it need to be ruggedized? Do you have compliance needs? Then being able to say, well, what does that hardware look like in that first production module run? Mm-hmm. What things need to be hardened? What ports need to be open, et cetera. Yeah. And then, like you said, kind of taking that to scale in a repeatable fashion. So I think that's pretty awesome.
That's right. Okay. So on that topic, you talk about what hardware do you want to start with? Well, if we bring up another tab, I want to demonstrate. This is the IoT device catalog for AWS. And what I'm showing here is actually a filtered view of the Qualification Catalog. And what this filtered view is including is some of our FreeArt qualified devices. And the reason I bring this up in the context of the customer 0 to 1 to n product design and support journey is that I talked about the importance of us in AWS IoT supporting customers and keeping the quality bar very high from the inception of the device all the way through device end of life. And talking about more on the inception end, we'd like you to start with a tested set of libraries, a tested kernel in the case of FreeArt, as well as tested hardware. So we have these IoT developer boards that we've tested in our lab and that we've worked with our partners to continuously test to ensure that that customers have a great experience when they use one of these qualified devices with the FreeArt kernel and libraries. So that starts you off in the right place on the journey rather than just pulling Raspberry Pi, off the shelf and putting that in your factory, right?
Yes. And I think it's interesting because we're diving into that product design, like the hardware design, and I think it's one of those things where customers don't realize, like when you get into hardware design, there is this strong kind of decision. It's kind of like that one-way, two-way door kind of thing. It's like, okay, like once I go down this journey, there's a chance where I really need to figure out all the things I need up front because it's going to impact, something might live in the field for decades. So if you kind of go down the route of just saying, I'll just throw something out there and figure it out later, you kind of then have to almost, restart the wheel all of a sudden. So it seems like such a critical junction point for customers.
I think so. I think so. And I think that one way we recognize that with our approach in qualification, as well as, device qualification specifically, working with our partners, as well as the way we've designed our libraries and our tests, our qualification tests, all of which are open source, is to say we understand that, I guess typically what you see is with device manufacturers, there's some strong relationships sometimes with existing silicon suppliers. Mm-hmm. So we respect that and we want to have as diverse a catalog as possible. But we also understand that product requirements can mature and evolve down the road. Mm-hmm. And sometimes our customers may find that a different supplier can better serve that need down the road. And frankly, the same applies to our software. It's an open source software kit, and we've got very carefully designed interfaces between each of our libraries at each of the network layers and that sort of thing. And that's kind of the same recognition. It's saying our library for, let's say, TCP/IP or MQTT may not best serve the customer right now or in the future. And that's okay because we have a clean interface design that allows the customer to say, okay, well, we would like these libraries from FreeRTOS, but we'd like these libraries from this other community or from this production relationship that we have already with an existing supplier.
So it's modular. Yeah.
It's very modular.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that mix and match, I think, allows the customer to get a best-in-class solution. Same with being able to choose from a variety of silicon suppliers.
Yeah, and so it's going to be interesting because I think we dive into some of the FreeRTOS code. I will make a plug because last week we talked about languages, and I'm pretty sure this is all compiled languages like C, for example. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah. So let me give you an example. Following your excellent segue there. So
I just want to make sure because I got a lot of JavaScript and Python last episode, and I was like, compile languages for the win. So I appreciate the high bar we set with a language like C that is compiled.
Okay, okay, but I feel compelled to point out, yes, no, not just low level. We do not discriminate. So we see a variety of software kits out there.
Yeah.
Higher level languages in IoT is actually a great thing that we are supporting and we want to continue to support for many reasons. One is that we want as many developers as possible to be able to pursue business opportunities that they see in IoT device inception and creation and prototyping and even going into production. And as hardware becomes more sophisticated each generation, I think the future, frankly, is fairly clear that interpreted languages are where this is going.
You're picking the wrong team.
Well, we can lay the groundwork here. We can lay the groundwork.
I should have sent you the snippet from the episode 1 so you could have been on my side. It hurts.
Next time. But let's bring it back to C for a second. So in terms of the C language libraries, and C, of course, is also the language that the FreeRTOS kernel is written in. What I want to show here in the screen share is that this C module is in our GitHub open source distribution. This is MIT licensed, so permissively open source licensed. And actually, what you're looking at here is our test module for OTA, which is over-the-air updates, actually specific for our agent API. And this is important because, let's look at a piece of test code. It's kind of boring in C, right, just in and of itself. But in terms of maintaining a high quality bar and serviceability, maintainability for an IoT device, field deployed, could be in the middle of nowhere, could have a 10-year, 20-year lifetime. It's very important, A, that you start with a high quality firmware implementation, which is where these tests come into play, which is where our long-term support pending release comes into play. But also that throughout that device's lifetime, any device that's connected or any computer that's connected to a network, and specifically to the internet, of course, that can't be patched, that can't be remotely patched, is not secure. I just want to say that. I know that's a strong statement, but if you can't service the device, it's not secure.
Yeah.
And so that's where tests like this come into play. We want to make sure that as you're servicing your device over its lifetime, that you can retest those patches the same way we retest our releases.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that highlighting the tests, as boring as testing may seem at the surface.
This is my nighttime read.
Why that is so important.
I get a nice cup of tea and I sit down and I go through every single line and it is riveting.
Fascinating. Oops, there's a bug.
Did you miss your
Next line. Yeah.
But I think what's interesting, because you brought up a point about testing and security, is that customers will come in and they'll basically say, I want to migrate over and use the IoT services on AWS, but by the way, I actually can't update them. What should I do? And it's like, oh, you need devices you can update, because it is the case that you look, 10, 15 years ago when things kind of launch in terms of security and what cipher suites we use and vulnerabilities, and those just change over time. So it's like you have to get on the board early. And then figure out how to update. Before diving back into the threat modeling, there was a question about kind of boot camps and exams and becoming an architect or an engineer at AWS. There's definitely a lot of resources to kind of get started in not just IoT, but AWS, especially around security. So if you haven't, if you're looking to take the exam or anything, definitely look at like the well-architected framework. We do that holistically across all AWS services. So you can say like, what security bar, operational excellence, cost optimization. Dan has also worked on the IoT well-architected lens. So kind of the same things we're kind of talking about. What's security, what's operational efficiency, how do you have continuity in your business objectives? They teach you all the best practices without having to read all the documentation. So definitely, I think I forget who called that out. Maybe it was Zebra.
Cool
Take
Zebra,
a look at those. Take a look at those white papers, and that will actually help you as you start thinking about what is the AWS way of doing things. So Dan, diving into threat modeling, because I know that's we kind of talk about security and stuff you can do. I'd be kind of interested in how you think about the once you have this, you have to be able to update it. How do you kind of make sure you stay within the guardrails?
Yeah, part of the while you just made the call out to the document that we
collaborated.
Collaborated on recently, the IoT lens well architected paper. As you pointed out, that paper walked through many of the considerations that are that we would like and that we recognize that our IoT device manufacturer customers go through, starting from business requirements, going through, well, this is an IoT device. What's the value we're getting on the service side? What's the downstream opportunities here from having this device be connected? A connected device comes with some risk. Let's be upfront about that. That goes to the security considerations that we're talking about in this session. With respect to threat modeling, it's important to keep in mind that as you're designing your device and as you're even as far upstream as you can get in the design phase, all the way up to your business requirements, you're thinking about, well, what are the flows in and out of this device, for example? Am I doing MQTT? Am I doing CBOR, protobuf? What are the ins and outs? An out typically could be, again, your telemetry data going up to the internet. It could be command and control information on a local network. And really what you want is literally a picture. You want to draw a picture of that data flow, of all those data flows, and you want to look and you want to say, okay, well, with each one of these data flows, what are the risks? And what are the benefits we get? And how are we going to mitigate these risks? We're going to start with qualified hardware. We're going to start with a lot of tested libraries. We're going to maintain that test bar throughout the history of the development or the lead of the development and the fielding of this device. And that's how we're going to mitigate some of this risk. And basically, at the end of that, what you end up with is a pretty comprehensive idea of what security risks you've taken care of, what security risks you've mitigated, and maybe what security risks you still have. And do those security risks that you still have require you to make a design change? Do they require you to maybe consider a different piece of hardware in order to mitigate that risk? Some piece of, let's say, a security component or something like that. So that you're ready to go into production with those risks mitigated.
But then you have that flexibility, right? From the start, you considering security, and then if something changes later on, you can still adapt to it.
That's right.
Versus just being like, I'm stuck with this hardware.
And actually, Rudy, I think that's a great point that I didn't even think of, and that is that it's that your security requirements actually do evolve. It's not a question of if, but rather when. Yeah. Right. The internet threat landscape is constantly changing. Right. And so build that into your design and your threat modeling process, so that 5 years down the road, when you're still servicing this device with updates, you have a way to meet those new threats with your future patches.
Yeah. And if you forgot to ruggedize it, you're going to have to clean out all the dust from that, that device.
Well, it's pretty funny because I remember I was working with a customer and in the healthcare space, applied like medical equipment, and we were talking about like the threat models they were seeing. And you're like, well, you wouldn't believe the most common thing we see is basically like a hacker coming in and like leaving a USB mouse on the table. And the mouse has firmware on it. And, the nurse comes in, she goes, oh, I need a mouse. She plugs it in, and all of a sudden they're on a network. Yeah. And so they were taking all of these older machines and literally covering up the USBs. Like, you have to go in and send someone to literally
epoxy the port.
Because it was just like something that wasn't as common, maybe like a couple of years ago, when it was just saying, oh, we're seeing this trend where all of a sudden this is becoming the vehicle because the networks are so secure. People are going, well, we just have to physically be there.
Yeah.
So kind of doing that analysis initially, but having that regular cadence of
That's right.
assessing new risk, figuring out what the mitigations are, and then how you deploy them.
It's a good reminder, actually, that you know, in the case of your healthcare provider, it sounds like what they've observed is that they've actually done a pretty good job of maintaining the security of their network, but now they have to come back and revisit some risks that they have in their physical security, and that comes back to the threat modeling exercise. Is you're investing in mitigating this risk and this risk and this risk. Well, now you have a new weakest link. And what are the bad guys going to go for? They're going to go for the weakest link. Right?
Most of the time.
Most of the time.
Most of the time.
Yeah. What's the easiest win?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Awesome. So I know you talked a little bit about the tests, like how are the tests run? Like how does that relate to some of the, like, let's say I want to start taking something to prototyping, and I still want to see some great prototyping examples for us to build.
I'm waiting for it.
Hint, hint. But as you think about prototyping, how do you take those tests and start automating them? What's your process to, make it a repeatable kind of checklist, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. Let's say so in the example, let's take the example of the cool zebra.
Okay.
Where we have the
Let's do it.
the stripes shifting black and white.
I feel like we're all building something.
Yeah. So there's going to be some sort of telemetry data coming from that cool zebra. Let's say that's MQTT. There's going to be some sort of command and control information coming back from the cloud where you might have your smartphone, and we're going to have a toggle on the smartphone that says, shift white to black.
Or even change the color.
Change the color to green and red. I mean, who knows, right? As you design each one of those libraries, each one of those interfaces, and even farther upstream, as we're, I should say you, actually, I'm not going to be doing this.
Well,
just
I mean,
to be honest. Yeah, okay. Anyway, as
Not
you
it,
are
not it,
selecting
not it.
the hardware and the libraries, what I will encourage you to do, Rudy, is...
I'm sending you a calendar invite, like, wait, put something on Dan's calendar.
Let me just,
So what would you encourage Rudy and Dan to do in this situation? I'm
So
curious.
if you're going to be taking this prototype and you're going to be sharing it publicly with our audience, please make sure that it works first, right? Which is going to require some testing. Okay, so on the screen share here, what we already talked about the OTA update agent.
Yep.
I hope that since you were going to have a connected cool zebra,
No, it has to be connected. Yeah.
that it is going to support firmware updates because otherwise it's not secure.
Yep.
Okay, so that's a consideration. But even farther upstream of that, so to speak, in your prototyping process, what we encourage our customers to do, as well as our internal prototyping partners, is to take a look at the protocol stack that you need to support in your firmware.
Yep.
And so for a TCP/IP connected device, which I suspect is what we're talking about here, what is very helpful is to look one layer, so to speak, one layer in the protocol at a time. So you might start with your TCP/IP library, and you might start with the way that your firmware is going to interact with TCP/IP, even locally, just like on your desk, for example, right? And so what we give you with our tests is the ability to build up your test execution in that same way. I've got a line highlighted there in the header file for our test configuration, which is saying, okay, I only want to run the TCP/IP tests. Okay, so you're going to make sure that your TCP/IP connection is working, it's real solid. Okay, and we're going to build up from there. From TCP/IP, you might go to TLS. Let's get some security going in there, right? Let's make sure that the server authentication is working and the client authentication is working. We want to make sure that the basic connection to the cloud is working. And after we do TLS, which you'll see is actually the next line after the one I had highlighted, now we're going to do our MQTT. So our MQTT packets are going to go over TLS. Our TLS is going to go over TCP/IP. I didn't mention, actually, you probably have an Ethernet driver in there or a Wi-Fi driver in there. That's part of this as well. You're probably going to be sourcing that driver from a silicon provider or some third party.
Yeah.
And that's all part of the stack that we want to make sure that as we build up step by step, that it's working as we add complexity to the firmware.
Yeah. So we're kind of seeing these tests on the screen, and I see the bits and ones and zeros. So it seems like you get the ability to tailor the test too. So
That's right.
is that kind of part of that, profiling of what your hardware looks like and prototyping and saying, okay, which test do I enable? And
Yes.
can you speak a little bit more about kind of that flexibility and what you're seeing customers do?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And so the reason I would say that we've made the tests very granular and piecemeal, you can see we've got like 2 pages of pound defines there that you can toggle for running one or more test groups within a single run. What that lets us do, frankly, as an engineering team, but also more to the point, our customers, is exactly like you said. You're going to have not only in your prototype phase, but also in your fielded device, is very likely not going to have all these requirements, right? So what's the point of running a bunch of tests on libraries that you don't even need to field, that you don't even need to have in your firmware? In fact, that's actually part of the threat modeling exercise, to link back to the earlier conversation, is that a way you mitigate risk in your firmware profile is you make sure that it's as small as possible.
Yep.
So don't add any stuff in there that you don't need, because what that stuff is going to give you is greater security risk. And
More
so
coverage you have to consider.
More coverage, that's right. So, but again, I mean, yes, we can test those existing libraries, right? Let's be clear about that. But there's no sense in packaging libraries into your firmware that you don't actually need in production.
Yeah.
Right? And if you're not going to package the libraries in your firmware for production use, then why run the test?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And there's some like the device tester gets updated pretty frequently too. So you're trying to stay in lockstep with, as you add features in FreeArt LTS, or you can run it in Greengrass as well.
Yeah.
The tester's iterating as well, just to kind of increase the scope of coverage.
That's right. Thank you. And actually, that gets us to qualifying your device. I bring this site up actually not only as a call out to the work that our silicon partners do in qualifying the developer boards that we showed earlier in the device catalog page, but also because qualifying your device, and actually I want to say up front, I think this is a message that we could do better in getting across in the way that that some of these pages here with our device qualification are written, and that is that the tests that I'm showing you, but also the documentation that goes behind the sequence that we've developed with our partners for creating and testing AWS IoT developer prototyping boards. That same test and that same build-up sequence, so to speak, is very useful for our customers in transitioning from a prototype board to a production module, a production embedded module.
Yeah.
Because we talk about, hey, test in this, go up the protocol stack like I was talking about. And here's how you do that, right? Here's how you configure the tests. Here's how you source your drivers and your libraries. There's a lot of documentation in the qualification program that actually helps customers make that transition from prototype board 0 to production module board 1, and then of course moving on as we've been talking about. So this qualification documentation actually is useful across the life cycle of the device.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting too, you kind of called it out, is that when customers see it, and it is something that's just like wrapping your head around, is you think qualification, you think silicon partners that are going to land in this.
That's right, in the catalog.
This catalog.
Yes.
But it extends more than that. It is a way that customers can basically say, I want to see if all of the drivers that I'm running, all of the interfaces I'm doing work.
Yeah.
Right? And so it doesn't mean you have to qualify your custom hardware. It just gives you a sanity check on, is the thing behaving like I think it should?
Is it still working?
Yes.
I've added this new driver as part of my effort. I've added
Yeah.
this new capability, maybe as part of a downstream servicing.
Unit testing.
Unit testing.
Yeah. It looks like we got a question here in the chat from Dugan AC. Will this toolkit go up to system site region load balancing and full availability testing? E.g. the highest available solutions, devices always able to reach central systems. That might be a question for you, Dan.
Yes, but let me clarify where the tests leave off, and
I might jump in.
the
Oh, yeah,
customer
do
mode.
it,
So I'm going
do
to
it.
segue to Wally here. So where the tests leave off is the tests give you the ability to run either on your device, or also relevant to this question also is the point that the test can run in a simulator. And so what you can do on your devices is you can run, let's say, a subset or like a lab scale kind of fleet of your connectivity tests, and let's say that you have some workload that you trigger in the cloud based on some message from those devices, right? And the tests will let you drive that. But there's a level of cloud design and cloud capability and load testing that inevitably goes beyond that. And at that point, I'm going to segue to Wally.
To extend off of what Dan was saying, what I tend to see customers do is two parts of that. One is a simulation fleet of devices. So you do have to be able to simulate not just devices, but different types of device behavior. So, great networks, spotty networks, bursty data, infrequent data. On the cloud side, you actually have to implement some code to basically do not just the IoT portion, but everything upstream. So that is, are you running DynamoDB? Are you using Kinesis? Are you using Lambda? And what I actually tell customers to do in those cases is to basically treat it almost like you would canary and chaos kind of testing. You can build all this infrastructure, especially if you do something like Lambda, which is all serverless. I have customers deploy that infrastructure and just let it sit there because there's no cost to having Lambda code just sitting in the cloud. And then they actually start their simulation test. And then on the cloud side, they start essentially pulling the levers on Lambda. So you might say, I need more provision capacity. Or my Kinesis streams are buffering, so I need to scale up Kinesis. And those are all things that if you put in CloudFormation, make it pretty easy to automate. And I actually recommend customers do that. And I think we call it out in the World Architect is, build your whole system, make sure it's all automated. So automating the tests on the hardware, automated on the cloud side, and then actually run these small scale tests. And then even start seeing what happens when things get throttled. Because most of the time what we find is when you get to production and you've done a lot of work on the hardware side to get it in a really clean place, you then forget that some of the cloud stuff actually needs to scale. And, customers will look up and go, oh, my database is 10 times as big as I thought it was supposed to be. Why is that happening? So,
well, in general, to add on to what you guys say, just make sure you test. Test before you put things into production. Unless you want to just do the whole, when I do my testing, I do it in production.
Yes.
But I would recommend that when you guys are saying all of this, test your hardware, test the connectivity, and in general, just make sure things are working before you push them through, because you never know. You never know what can happen.
Yeah.
And you know what, just to kind of go back to that whole prototyping thing and the partner device catalog, if you're looking at boards to try out, I tried the STM32. It's from S3 Microelectronics. And the reason I like this board is, and again, this is not a plug, this is just what I've used, is that it's got some built-in sensors. So it's got a gyroscope, accelerometer, proximity, temperature, humidity. So you can get pretty cool data like from the beginning. You don't have to go in and plug devices onto your microcontroller. And again, this is free RTOS compatible.
And for each, I also want to point out that for each of the of the devices, thank you, Wally. For each of the and the ST one is in that list somewhere.
Yeah.
For each of the boards listed in this filtered view of the qualification catalog, if you drill into the link for that board, you will find a link to the code, the Amazon FreeArTOS and FreeArTOS kernel and library code that we've done the porting, or that the Silicon partner has done the porting and testing for. Yes, thank you. And then that code will give you the starting point for opening up a project or solution file in the preferred or recommended IDE for that board. Which in the case of ST Micro, I believe is System Workbench.
Yep.
And then in System Workbench, you're just going to be able to type in your account information for AWS IoT and at least start with a whole working protocol stack, end-to-end, MQTT, doing some hello world kind of messaging. And then you build on that capability from there, going to Shadow, going to OTA, adding in some of those sensor drivers. We give you a running start. So the test coverage we give you is kind of a reflection of how far we've gotten with our library design interfaces that we've been able to scale across a wide variety of providers and hardware. You're still going to encounter, let's say once you pick this board or these components from your preferred supplier, one of the big microcontroller manufacturers, you gave an example of which there, you are likely to encounter that there's going to be some classes of drivers, some classes of hardware that you're going to have to add that driver back into the starter package that we provide.
Yeah.
Right. So that's part of the work, right, of going from board 0 to board 1.
And
okay. And it was actually an interesting question because you were talking about the tools. So someone was asking what tools do you need to get started other than a computer? if you want to start using some of these kits. Do you need to solder them? Do you need jumpers? So you see, I know Rudy might have a thought. I don't want to get back. I don't want to prototype the Zebra here. But Dan, do you see like people starting with just the initial board, just starting from there? IDE, probably a Windows machine. What are you seeing people bring in addition to that?
So actually, I see people start even upstream of that, and what I mean by that is with FreeArt LTS. By far, the easiest way to start is with our simulator. And what the simulator is actually giving you is a running, executing version of the kernel and the scheduler. It's just that, of course, that the timer and stuff like that, those are simulated. But in any case, it's the full kernel running. It's all of our libraries running, and that gives you the ability to do a lot of prototyping if you so choose, without even having to transition to, for example, an IoT developer board like the one you have.
So you do simulate everything, and then when you want to go to a prototype board, and in this case, you could get one that has built-in sensors. If you don't want to solder things, you can actually plug it in using a breadboard. If you're going to plug in other sensors, so that's another option.
Yes.
But there was one other quick question. Love to get your thoughts on that. Someone was asking, is this something you see in federal? Like federal use cases, maybe like...
Dugan AC again. Yeah, there we go.
Are you seeing how that's kind of playing out? Is that early on in days? I know FreeArt LTS has been around for a while too, so I know there's some best practices there.
Yeah, in terms of federal, that's... no, I wouldn't say that I can comment on specific requirements that we've seen in that space. There are, of course, with many verticals, federal being an example, there are certification and compliance regime requirements that apply. That's not something that we're bringing as the FreeArt LTS engineering team right now, but we are working with partners who have, for example, common criteria qualified components, common criteria qualified devices. So there's more of a partnership opportunity for meeting the requirements of those specific verticals, federal being an example, oil and gas, you talked about healthcare. Again, that's something that it's important to work with your partners to make sure that you're sourcing components that can meet those requirements, and that you're anticipating those requirements downstream, which I understand is probably where your question is coming from.
So Dan, you have definitely covered a lot. So I think we've got awesome places to get started on the FreeArt LTS side, all the things about security. How would you kind of guide someone on this journey? If you could say, hey, here's the tricks and places you should really keep in mind as you begin.
Yeah, sure. Don't ignore testing. It's really exciting to start with. The demos that we've just been talking with an IoT developer board, kind of seeing your hello world blinky lights thing working for the first time. Mm-hmm. That's great. We want to get that excitement and we want to get that running head start to developing your firmware. But for the long term, for the success of the product, the success of the device, actually the testing is just as important, if not more important. And so think about the role that our tests, the work that we've done, providing library and FreeArt LTS kernel tests, think about reusing that work, as well as the qualification work that our silicon partners have done, as you go from simulator to board prototype to production module number 1 to end products fielded. How testing applies to each one of those phases and how you're bringing that investment forward along with you.
There are some capabilities where you can actually auto-deploy things like your over-the-air updates. Mm-hmm. So if you're seeing my console, like definitely is another kind of trick as you start testing this, and FreeArt LTS supports OTA capabilities as well. Do things like create jobs, like deployment processes, packages. And a benefit here is that you can basically set up any kind of profile for updating your devices. You can say, if it comes online with a patch that's insecure now, automatically update it. If it's it's sitting on a warehouse for 6 months, it should be updated. Yeah. So go in and use a job functionality as well. Mm-hmm. So it's something that's easy to get started with. And then the benefit is it's all kind of console or API driven. So you can create a different group, you can group your devices, and then you even select how your jobs get delivered. So super easy to use, and I think that kind of dovetails with where you get started. You start with that qualified hardware, you go through the qualification process, figure out the peripherals you need, what to use.
When you provision your device and you get those certificates, make sure you keep those safe. Because so many times I provision certificates and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I need to refresh my device. I'm like, wait, where did I put those again? So it's just like keep those when you, especially when you're prototyping, because otherwise you're gonna have to go in and re-provision. Not that it's the worst case scenario, but
Yeah.
It's just handy to have those like.
Treat it as business critical data
Oh,
that's
yes,
what it is.
it is business. You're right.
Yeah,
It is
yeah.
business critical data. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. It looks like we actually had a challenge posed.
Okay.
This is.
I think we are nearing.
Yeah, we're
the
nearing-
end looking at some of these challenges. So
Yeah.
let's see. What is? It's not a Dragon Ball Z one.
Build
which is
some kind of
disappointing.
ground vehicle and some quadcopter drone.
That's awesome.
Then use the camera of the drone to plan the path of the ground vehicle and make sure the ground vehicle reaches its destination. The drone should have some cellular connection device to connect to the cloud and connect to SageMaker for path planning, and the vehicle has only some Wi-Fi to connect to the drone.
Good luck, Reed.
let me just check my schedule, right?
That is much better than Cool Zebra.
I wanted to
So,
go. I wanted to go Super Saiyan, and I think we're gonna be doing that instead.
Yeah, okay. We'll get back to you on that.
Okay. I actually love that idea. I think it's awesome.
That is
It's
an
a
awesome
freaking
idea.
cool idea.
Yes.
This is awesome. I mean, I think we've got some pretty cool challenges.
Yeah.
I would say keep them in the chat because we will go through them. And what we do is we announce which one we're going to pick on the next episode in a couple weeks. So we will go through all the great submissions. Please submit
Well,
the.
I mean, we're gonna have to check our schedules.
We're gonna have to check our schedules. We'll pick a winner. We won't build it on the next one. We'll give ourselves a little bit of runway.
Well, building that in 1 hour.
I think what we have to do is we'll pick it, and then we have to pick when we're going to show it.
Oh, I see.
A date for a date.
A date for a date.
Date for a date.
Dan, I'm glad we had you join on this
Yeah.
episode because I think
Likewise. Thank you.
it's like so much information and getting to pick your brain has just been fantastic.
Thank you very much. Very enjoyable. Thanks.
So if you do like Dan as well, we can nudge him back. Maybe he can help us with the zebra, but
Yeah.
keep him in mind. And I would say hopefully we see you next time.
Yeah.
On IoT.
All
the
the
things.
Alexa, turn off studio.
No, don't do that.